You know, when you've been married for over 3 decades, you think you know everything about your partner, every habit, every mood, every secret they might be keeping from the world. I was that confident in my marriage, so sure that after 32 years together, my husband and I had built something special, something solid that nothing and no one could ever break apart. We weren't just husband and wife going through the motions of daily life. We were best friends who laughed at inside jokes, partners who supported each other through every challenge, a team that tackled everything life threw at us side by side. At least, that's what I told myself every single day when I woke up next to him, when we shared our morning coffee, when we talked about our plans for the future. But life is a strange and sometimes cruel way of showing you the truth when you least expect it, when you're most comfortable and least prepared for what's coming. Mine came in the form of a simple idea that popped into my head one quiet afternoon while I was folding laundry and thinking about how predictable our routine had become. What if I pretended to go on a trip and told him I was leaving for a few days to visit my sister? But instead of actually going, I stayed close by and watched what he would do when he thought I was miles away and completely out of the picture. It seemed almost harmless at the time, maybe even a little silly, like something you'd see in a movie rather than actually do in real life. So I packed my suitcase with enough clothes to make it believable, kissed him goodbye at the door like I always did, and walked out of our home with my heart pounding in my chest. But I didn't drive to my sister's house or check into a hotel somewhere far away. I stayed hidden nearby, waiting and watching to see what would happen in my absence. And what I discovered when I quietly came back home, slipping through the door I thought I knew so well, shattered every single thing I thought I knew about the man I had loved and trusted for more than half my life. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where values like honesty, hard work, and loyalty weren't just words people threw around, but principles you actually lived by every single day. My parents weren't wealthy by any means, but they taught me that a good life wasn't measured by what you owned, but by the love you gave and the commitments you kept. And I carried those lessons with me into adulthood like precious heirlooms passed down through generations. I met Richard when I was just 23 years old, working as a secretary at a local insurance office where he came in one afternoon to update his policy, and I still remember how his smile made my heart skip in a way I'd never experienced before. Our courtship was simple and sweet, filled with long walks in the park, handwritten letters when he traveled for work, and quiet dinners where we talked about our dreams of building a life together that would stand the test of time. We married within a year, bought a modest house with a white picket fence that needed painting, and started filling it with laughter, arguments, compromises, and eventually 3 beautiful children who became the center of our universe. Those early years were hard in the way that building anything worthwhile is hard. We struggled with money, with sleepless nights when the babies were sick, with the everyday challenges of learning to be partners and parents at the same time. But we did it together, always together. And I thought that bond we formed in those difficult years was unbreakable, forged in a kind of fire that only makes love stronger and deeper. The decades rolled by in a comfortable rhythm of school plays and birthday parties, of holidays spent with extended family, of quiet evenings on the porch watching the sunset after long days of work. I knew his morning routine better than my own, knew exactly how he liked his eggs cooked, knew the way he'd sigh when he was tired and the way he'd laugh at his own jokes that weren't really that funny. But looking back now with the clarity that only hindsight provides, I realized there were small things that changed in recent years, tiny shifts in his behavior that I brushed aside as nothing more than the natural evolution of a long marriage. He started staying up later than usual, claiming he couldn't sleep and needed to watch television to relax his mind. He became protective of his phone in a way he never had been before, always keeping it face down on the table and taking it with him even when he just went to the bathroom. When I'd ask him casual questions about his day, his answers became vaguer, less detailed, as if he was editing out parts of his life that he didn't want me to see. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just the natural wear and tear of a long marriage where romance fades into comfortable companionship and excitement gets replaced by predictable routines that feel safe even if they are a little boring. But then the small inconsistencies started piling up in ways that became harder and harder to ignore, each one adding another layer of doubt to the foundation I thought was so solid. He started wearing a new cologne, Something expensive and sophisticated that smelled nothing like the familiar aftershave he'd worn for years, and when I mentioned it with a surprised smile, he got defensive and said it was just something he picked up on a whim without thinking much about it. His late meetings at work became more frequent, stretching into evenings where he'd come home after I'd already eaten dinner alone, apologizing with exhausted eyes but offering no real details about what kept him so busy. I found receipts in his jacket pockets when I was doing laundry, receipts from restaurants I'd never heard of in neighborhoods we never visited together. And when I casually asked if he'd had lunch somewhere new, he'd look confused for just a split second before nodding and changing the subject so smoothly I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. The bank statements started showing cash withdrawals I couldn't account for. Not huge amounts that would raise immediate alarm bells, but enough to make me wonder what he needed that money for when we paid for everything with our joint credit card. He became obsessed with his phone in a way that felt almost like an addiction, constantly checking it during meals, texting while we watched television together, and I noticed how quickly he'd flip it over or put it in his pocket whenever I came near, as if he was guarding state secrets instead of just casual messages. There were nights when he'd suddenly announce he needed to run an errand. That couldn't wait until morning, disappearing for an hour or two with explanations that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. I started feeling like a stranger in my own marriage, watching a man I thought I knew become someone I couldn't quite recognize anymore. And the worst part was how much I wanted to believe his excuses, how desperately I clung to the hope that I was just being paranoid and insecure. Then came the opportunity one never expected, the moment when everything would either confirm my worst fears or prove that I had been overthinking everything and damaging my marriage with baseless suspicions. I had signed up for a 3-day church retreat that was scheduled to take place a few hours away, something I'd been looking forward to as a chance to reconnect with my faith and get some peace of mind away from the tension that had been building in our home. The night before I was supposed to leave, my phone rang with news that the retreat had been postponed due to some logistical issues with the venue. And as I hung up the call, a thought entered my mind that felt both brilliant and terrifying at the same time. What if I didn't tell Richard about the cancellation and pretended to go on the trip anyway? What if I created a situation where he thought he had 3 full days of freedom without me watching, without me asking questions, without me being anywhere near our home? The idea consumed me for the rest of that evening as I lay in bed next to him, listening to him breathe in the darkness while my mind raced through every possible scenario of what might happen. Part of me hoped desperately that I would discover nothing, that he would spend those days doing exactly what he always did when I was away, watching his favorite shows and eating takeout and maybe calling to check on me because he missed hearing my voice. But another part of me, the part that had been collecting all those small pieces of evidence like puzzle fragments, knew with a sinking certainty that I was about to uncover something I could never unsee, something that would change the trajectory of our lives forever. The next morning, I went through the motions of preparing to leave, packing my suitcase with clothes I wouldn't actually need, making breakfast like it was any ordinary day, kissing him goodbye at the front door while my heart hammered so hard I thought he might hear it. I drove away from our house with tears already forming in my eyes, not because I was sad to leave, but because I was terrified of what I would find when I came back. I circled back by midday after spending a few hours at a coffee shop across town where nobody knew me, where I could sit in a corner booth and try to calm the anxiety that was eating me alive from the inside out. When I pulled up to our street, I parked a few houses down and walked quietly toward our home, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get my key into the lock. The house was completely empty when I stepped inside, silent in a way that felt almost suffocating, and Richard's car was gone from the driveway where it should have been if he'd taken the day off or work from home like he sometimes did. I moved through the rooms like a detective searching for clues I wasn't sure I wanted to find, noticing immediately that things were different in ways that made my stomach drop. Several of his good shirts were missing from the closet, the ones he only wore when he wanted to look his best for special occasions or important meetings, and I couldn't understand why he would need them when I was supposedly away and he had no reason to impress anyone. In the kitchen sink sat 2 wine glasses that still had traces of red wine dried at the bottom, and we hadn't had wine together in weeks, maybe even months, which meant he'd been drinking with someone else in our home while I was meant to be miles away. The air in our bedroom smelled different, carrying a hint of perfume that definitely wasn't mine, something floral and sweet that made me feel like I was standing in a stranger's house rather than the room where I'd slept for 3 decades. The bed wasn't made the way I always made it, with the covers pulled tight and the pillows arranged just so, but instead looked like it had been hastily straightened by someone who didn't know or care about getting the details right. My hands were trembling as I walked over to the nightstand where Richard sometimes left his tablet charging, and when I picked it up, the screen lit up with a notification that stopped my heart completely. It was a text message from someone saved in his contacts simply as L, and the words glowed on the screen like they were mocking me. "Can't wait to see you today." Just 6 words that confirmed everything I'd been afraid to admit to myself. 6 words that meant my husband was somewhere right now with someone whose existence he'd hidden from me. My fingers moved almost automatically as I opened the banking app on my phone. Something I rarely checked because I trusted him to manage our finances the way he always had, and then it was staring back at me in black and white. A charge from earlier that morning at a downtown hotel I recognized by name but had never had any reason to visit. I didn't think about what I was doing as I called a taxi and gave the driver the address. Sitting in the back seat with my heart pounding so violently I thought I might be sick all over the leather seats. The hotel was one of those upscale places with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, the kind where people go for romantic getaways or secret meetings they don't want anyone to know about. And I stood outside the entrance for several minutes trying to force my legs to move forward. When I finally walked through those revolving doors into the elegant lobby, I went straight to the front desk where a young woman with perfect makeup smiled at me politely, and I heard myself asking in a voice that didn't sound like my own if my husband Richard had checked in today. She looked uncomfortable as she glanced at her computer screen, and after a pause that felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly and confirmed that yes, he was in room 306, but then she added quietly with sympathy in her eyes that he wasn't alone, that he'd checked in with someone else. I couldn't move toward the elevators right away, couldn't force myself to take that final step toward whatever truth was waiting for me on the 3rd floor, so I sank into one of the plush chairs in the lobby and tried to process what was happening. I thought about all those years we'd spent together, every sacrifice I'd made to support his career when he needed to work late, or travel for business. Every time I'd put his needs and our children's needs before my own without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. I thought about the vows we'd spoken in front of our families and God, promises to love and honor each other in sickness and health, for better or worse, until death parted us, and I wondered how something I believed was so sacred could have crumbled away without me even noticing it was happening. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the elevator on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment, pressed the button for the 3rd floor, and watched the numbers light up as I rose toward a truth I still couldn't fully comprehend. I found room 306 at the end of a long hallway that seemed to stretch forever, and I stood outside that door for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds before I finally raised my hand and knocked. When the door opened, Richard stood there with his shirt partially unbuttoned and his face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to speak but couldn't find any words that would make sense of this moment. But it wasn't just his shock that paralyzed me. It was the person standing behind him in the doorway, still adjusting her blouse and looking at me with eyes filled with guilt and something that might have been shame. It was Lydia, my own sister, the woman I had trusted more than anyone else in the world besides my husband, the person I called when I needed advice or comfort or just someone to laugh with about the absurdities of life. The woman who was supposed to be the reason I was away on this trip in the first place. The sister who had stood beside me at my wedding and held my hand through every crisis and celebrated every joy. She was the L in his phone, the secret he'd been keeping, the reason for all those unexplained absences and strange behaviors that had slowly been eating away at our marriage. Richard started talking, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush as he tried to explain that it wasn't what I thought, that it had started innocently years ago after Lydia's divorce when she was devastated and needed someone to lean on for emotional support. He said it was just conversations at first, just being there for her when she felt alone and broken. But those conversations grew deeper and more intimate until they realized they had feelings neither of them had planned on developing. Lydia was crying now, reaching out toward me with trembling hands and begging me to understand that they never meant for this to happen, that it was an accidental closeness that spiraled into something neither of them knew how to stop or control. Richard admitted, his voice cracking with what might have been genuine regret, that he'd been planning to ask me for a divorce after the holidays because he didn't want to ruin Christmas for our children and grandchildren, that he'd been waiting for the right time, as if there could ever be a right time to destroy everything we'd built together. I didn't scream or cry or throw things the way part of me wanted to. Didn't give them the dramatic confrontation they might have been expecting or perhaps even hoping for so they could feel like I was the unreasonable one. Instead, I turned around and walked out of that hotel room with my head held high and my heart shattered into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together again. I moved out of our home within the week, staying with a friend who asked no questions and simply held me when I needed to fall apart, and I filed for divorce before the month was over because I knew there was no coming back from this kind of betrayal. Our family fractured in ways that will never fully heal, with our children forced to choose sides and holidays becoming exercises in careful scheduling to avoid putting everyone in the same room. Years passed before I could even speak about what happened without feeling that raw ache in my chest. And even now, as I tell this story, there's still a small part of me that wonders what I could have done differently, what signs I should have seen earlier, whether I was somehow blind to problems that were obvious to everyone else. But I've learned something important through all this pain, something I want you to understand if you're watching this and wondering about your own relationship, your own doubts, your own nagging suspicions that something isn't quite right. People change silently, often in ways we don't notice until the transformation is already complete, and betrayal doesn't usually announce itself with obvious signs but grows quietly in hidden spaces we're too trusting or too comfortable to examine. Testing a spouse the way I did might reveal truths you're not prepared to handle, truths that will change your life in ways you can't undo. But sometimes knowing the truth is better than living in a beautiful lie that's slowly poisoning everything you believe about your life and yourself. Choose truth over comfort. Choose communication over silent suffering. And most importantly, choose self-respect over the desperate need to hold on to something that's already gone.